I'm just going live on YouTube and we are being recorded. Okay. Apparently I am not seeing that I am online. Yes, yeah. Okay, that's what I need. I don't know why, but the YouTube is constantly giving me this chat box too low on the screen for me to be able to read it. So I apologize for that to my YouTube audience. I may not see your chats, but I will do my best. Let's see, how can I make this smaller? That's how I can do it. Hi, Nancy. That's how to do this. Okay, we are here. And I have two panelists. We're being recorded. As long as you leave your video off, you cannot be seen, but you can be heard if you unmute and respond. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Murder of the Hero, which is one of the major topics that Jung covered in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And I'm reading from this book, the Red Book Reader's Edition. And I have that note on there. Okay, the Red Book Reader's Edition. And so I'm on page 160 to begin with. I'm going to start with footnote 112, which begins this section because it specifies the date upon which this passage was written, which is December 18th, 1913. That's significant, of course, because around that date, he was having several precognitive dreams about the beginning of World War I. And he wasn't understanding these dreams very well. He thought he might be having a schizophrenia attack, but of course he wasn't, and he later knew that. But he only knew that for sure on August the 1st, 1914, about 7 months later, 7.5 months later, because that was the day that war officially broke out in Europe to begin World War I. And up until that point, he had had several precognitive dreams, about 12 of them, including 5 that were very, very significant visions in a waking state. And he didn't really know what to make of them, but what he said that on August the 1st, on August the 1st, 1914, he was the happiest man alive because he realized he wasn't having a schizophrenia attack. He had actually had precognitive dreams, and so that put them in place. So in Murder of the Hero, you'll hear him being talking about one of the things that was really eating him at that time. And so there are a lot of footnotes here, but I will, I'm not going to read them all, but there's another footnote that's probably useful because this passage is about Siegfried. And Siegfried in a footnote, it says here, Siegfried was a heroic prince who appears in Old German and Norse epics. In the 12th century, Nibelunged is described as follows. And in what magnificent style Siegfried rode. He bore a great spear, stout of shaft and broad of head. His handsome sword reached down to his spurs, and the fine horn which this lord carried was of reddest gold. His wife Brunhild is tricked into revealing the only place where he could be wounded and killed. Wagner reworked these epics in The Ring of the Nibelung. In 1912, in Transformation and Symbols of the Libido, Jung presented a psychological interpretation of Siegfried as a symbol of the libido, principally citing Wagner's libretto of Siegfried. Okay, so good morning, Jordan, and welcome aboard, sir.
Morning, Skip. I'm going to mute for a couple of minutes. My coffee maker's being really noisy.
Okay. So I'm going to begin reading. So I'm reading from chapter 7 of the Red Book. And good morning, Art. Nice to see you. I'm quite well, thank you. On the following night, however, I had a vision. I was with a youth in high mountains. It was before daybreak. The eastern sky was already light. Then Siegfried's horn resounded over the mountains with a jubilant sound. We knew that our mortal enemy was coming. We were armed and lurked beside a narrow rocky path to murder him. Then we saw him coming high across the mountain on a chariot made of bones of the dead. He drove boldly and magnificently over the steep rocks and arrived at the narrow path where we waited in hiding. As he came around the turn ahead of us, we fired at the same time, and he fell slain. Thereupon, I turned to flee, and a terrible rain swept down. But after this, I went through a torment unto death, and I felt certain that I must kill myself if I could not solve the riddle of the murder of the hero. Okay, so that's how intensely Dr. Jung felt about this dream that he had. Then the spirit of the depths came to me and spoke these words, quote, "The highest truth is one and the same with the absurd," unquote. This statement saved me, and like the rain after a long hot spell, it swept away everything in me which was too highly tensed. Then I had a second vision. I saw a merry garden in which forms walked clad in white silk, all covered in colored light, some reddish, the others bluish and greenish. I know I have stridden across the depths. Through guilt, I have become a newborn. All right. Then part 2. We also live in our dreams. We do not live only by day. Sometimes we accomplish our greatest deeds in dreams. In that night, my life was threatened, since I had to kill my Lord and God, not in single combat, since who among us mortals could kill a god in a duel? You can reach your God only as an assassin if you want to overcome him. But this is the bitterest for mortal men. Our gods want to be overcome, since they require renewal. If men kill their princes, they do so because they cannot kill their gods, and because they do not know that they should kill their gods in themselves. Okay, I'm going to stop at that point. There's a passage in italics here, but I want to stop at that point. Let me go back and read a couple of other footnotes that relate to this. In Black Book 2, Jung noted, I strolled light-footedly up an incredibly steep path and later helped my wife, who followed me at a slower pace, to ascend. Some people mocked us, but I didn't mind, since this showed that they didn't know that I had murdered the hero. Jung recounted this dream in the 1925 seminar, stressing different details. He preceded it with the following remarks. Siegfried was not an especially sympathetic figure to me, and I don't know why my unconscious got engrossed in him. Wagner's Siegfried, especially, is exaggerated, extroverted, and at times actually ridiculous. I never liked him. Nevertheless, the dream showed him to be my hero. I could not understand the strong emotion I had with the dream. After narrating the dream, Jung concluded, I felt an enormous pity for him, Siegfried, as though I myself had been shot. I must then have had a hero I did not appreciate, and it was my ideal force and efficiency I had killed. I had killed my intellect, helped on to the deed by a personification of the collective unconscious, the little brown man with me. In other words, I deposed my superior function. The rain that fell is a symbol of the release of tension. That is, the forces of the unconscious are loosed. When this happens, the feeling of relief is engendered. The crime is expiated because as soon as the main function is deposed, there is a chance for other sides of the personality to be born into life. And that's from Introduction to Jungian Psychology, pages 61 and 62. In Black Book 2, and in his later remarks about this dream in Memories, Jung said that he felt he would have to kill himself if he could not solve the riddle. Okay, and he had a pistol in his nightstand and apparently almost used it on that night, he said in Memories. Okay. These lights pervaded in my mind. Oh, okay. So he's talking about the second dream. And I fell asleep again. A second dream vision rose in me. And he's talking about the dream of people walking and clad in white silk. And he says, these lights pervaded my mind and senses. And once again, I fell asleep like a convalescent. Jung recounted this dream to Agnella Jaffe and commented that after he had been confronted with the shadow, as in the Siegfried dream, this dream expressed the idea that he was one thing and something else at the same time. The unconscious reached beyond one, like a saint's halo. The shadow was like the light-colored sphere that surrounded the people. He thought this was a vision of the beyond, where men are complete. Okay. And then one more footnote, where he had said in the Red Book, I know I have stridden across the depths. Through guilt, I have become a newborn. And the footnote reads, the world in between is a world of simplest things. It is not a world of intention and imperatives, but a perchance world with indefinite possibilities. Here, the next ways are all small, no broad, straight high roads, no heaven above, no hell beneath. In October 1916, Jung gave some talks in the Psychological Club called Adaptation, Individuation, and Collectivity, in which he commented on the importance of guilt. The first step in individuation is tragic guilt. the accumulation of guilt demands expiation. Okay, so expiation is where you make amends to the gods. We'll get into that later, but Jordan, your turn to talk.
I think it's interesting how intense his Tom Sawyer Huckleberry Finn inner life is, and how beautifully seriously he takes it. Except what's interesting is, I think in this, with the whole "I must kill myself if I can't solve the riddle," he also gets the melodrama of a kid going on there, where and I don't know if in any other place I've seen him so enraptured and taken in by not the seriousness of something, but something here that is child's play, that is adult war inside. And so, like you said, the both at one time. I think it's curious in his in Man and His Symbols. I can't remember the page, but he indicates once the individual has passed his initial test and can enter the mature phase of life, the hero myth loses its relevance. The hero's symbolic death becomes, as it were, the achievement of that maturity. And I think here, when he and his partner in crime slay the god, and then the rains come, the unconscious has become conscious, I think, in the rains. And I think that's important here. And also the footnote of the Judas, as it were. There's a self-betrayal piece that's going on, that he's also stepping around, so that he's doing this to not betray himself, it feels.
Righto. And by the way, Kathy said that she may join us, so I have just resent her the link. And
excellent.
Also, during the next break, I will put the MailChimp coordinates into the YouTube chat, so that everybody who wants to join us can do. Okay. So do you want to read the second part, Jordan?
Certainly. Is that background noise too much, or is it good?
I'm not hearing it.
Okay. Part 2 of Murder of the Hero. We also live in our dreams. We do not live only by day. Sometimes we accomplish our greatest deeds in dreams. In that night, my life was threatened, since I had to kill my Lord and God, not in single combat, since who among mortals could kill a god in a duel? You can reach your God only as an assassin, or Judas, as it would be, if you want to overcome him. But this is the bitterest for mortal men. Our gods want to be overcome, since they require renewal. If men kill their princes, they do so because they cannot kill their gods, and because they do not know that they should kill their gods in themselves. And then he goes into the italics. If the god grows old, he becomes shadow, nonsense, and he goes down. The greatest truth becomes the greatest lie. The brightest day becomes darkest night. As day requires night and night requires day, so meaning requires absurdity, and absurdity requires meaning. Day does not exist through itself. Night does not exist through itself. The reality that exists through itself is day and night. So the reality is meaning and absurdity. Noon is a moment. Midnight is a moment. Morning comes from night. Evening turns into night. But evening comes from the day, and morning turns into day. And then he continues, so meaning is a moment and a transition from absurdity to absurdity, and absurdity only a moment and a transition from meaning to meaning. Oh, that Siegfried, blonde and blue-eyed, the German hero, had to fall by my hand. The most loyal and courageous. He had everything in himself that I reassured
Treasure.
that I treasured as the greater and more beautiful. He was my power, my boldness, my pride. I would have gone under in the same battle, and so only assassination was left to me. If I wanted to go on living, it could only be through trickery and cunning. Judge not. Think of the blonde savage of the German forests who had to betray the hammer brandishing thunder to the pale Near Eastern god who was nailed to the wood like a chicken martin, the birds. The courageous were overcome by certain contempt for themselves, but their life force bade them to go on living, and they betrayed their beautiful wild gods, their holy trees, and their awe of the German forests. What does Siegfried mean for the Germans? What does it tell us that the Germans suffer Siegfried's death? That is why I almost preferred to kill myself in order to spare him, but I wanted to go on living with a new God. After death on the cross, Christ went into the underworld and became hell. Read that again. After death on the cross, Christ went into the underworld and became hell. So he took on the form of the Antichrist, the dragon. The image of the Antichrist, which has come down to us from the ancients, announces the new God, whose coming the ancients had foreseen. Gods are unavoidable. The more you flee from the God, the more surely you will fall into his hand. The rain is the greatest stream of tears that will come over the peoples, the tearful flood of released tension after the constriction of death had encumbered the peoples with horrific force. It is the mourning of the dead in me which precedes burial and rebirth. The rain is fructifying of the earth. It begets the new wheat, the young, germinating God.
Okay, let's look and see if anybody has commented. No one has commented on this, and so we can go on. But what do I have to say about this? This is Jung realizing the duality of the psyche, realizing that we cannot solve this duality, that our shadow is always with us, and it is in this moment that personality starts to come into its own. And so Jung is, as a 38-year-old man at this point, I think that's right. Yep, 38-year-old man at this point, just realizing that there are two sides to his life, and that one side is stronger than the other, and he must kill that side in order to be whole, interact with life. So in my case, where I'm in the 99th percentile of intuition on the Myers-Briggs test, I have to kill my pride about that in order to recognize that I don't see what others cannot get. In other words, in the sensing to intuition spectrum, I'm way out on the intuition side, and I don't understand, I don't know, I can't comprehend easily from my own personality what facts I would need to present to persuade somebody who is a sensing person. And if somebody is way out on the sensing side, they just don't get it at all. They can be shown many things and they don't get it. So my simplified version of this is that you can show an intuitive person, and I mean on the 99th percent intuitive, 3 trees and they'll assume there's a forest. But a 99th percentile sensing person, you can show 1,000 trees and they won't believe there's a forest. And so I know from my long study of Jungian psychology that I have that kind of defect in me, which is way, way out on the intuitive scale. And I'm blind. I have this blind spot where I don't know what facts I have to present to get through to people. That's my problem. And it's a problem of my personality. And so very often I don't get the details that need to be presented. And so I know that I have to kill my intuition. When I have a sudden insight, I know, as Jung knows through this passage, that I have to kill off that intuition and go back and very pedantically go through the mundane facts that lead up to that intuition in order to understand what I must say in order to be persuasive. I guess that's one example. So for me, my hero is the intuition, the extreme intuitional side. And I have to kill that or throttle it, grab it by the throat and say, okay, what am I missing here? In order to be whole. And this affected me in the practice of law because for me, it was always easy. Every case was easy and it was obvious what the result would be. And, that's still the case with me on the denouement of the Trump era in the United States. I know what the result is going to be. But it's very hard for me to throttle my intuition and say, okay, what facts need to be presented so that hyper sensing people, of which most people are, and certainly most men are, do I need to present to get them to see the intuition that I see, what needs to be presented. And part of the answer to that is we simply need the talking heads of television repeating over and over again what's happening so that they start to see, oh, if I attack the Capitol, I'm going to end up in jail. Because I'm violating the law. Okay, but they have to get that. They have to grok that before they can see, oh, okay, I get why I'm wrong. And maybe they don't never see that until they're serving 3 years in jail for carrying a Confederate flag through the Capitol. But we have to remember that Robert E. Lee and all the Confederate soldiers were traitors to the United States. They were traitors. And so our support of them now is supporting treachery, supporting divisive forces in our country, supporting the shadow side of our country, which still exists, obviously. Okay, I'll shut up. Jordan, go for it.
No, I think I like the depth you went into there, because then from the Confederate side, the U.S. is the shadow, and so there's each attempt to kill the other. Except what's interesting here is I think we also see the birthplace of an anti-adromia in this passage, where the tendency of to become its opposite. And I think it's important because, for example, I laugh. I mean, I like the way you put it. Your brain damage is that you must kill the intuition. My brain damage is, oh, cool, look at intuition. I'll take it by the hand and go run naked through the daisies with it. I mean, it's like, but the thing is, at the end of the daisies, I put it into the gas tank of the car, so to speak, and it's fuel. Because what happens is by the time I realize through that dance, oh, all alone by itself, this thing is too pure, too intense, and therefore toxic. And then, the reason steps in and goes, oh, we'll stick it in the gas tank. Then you can go vroom, vroom. But that's harnessing opposites and understanding how to deal with intensities. So where you kill it, I'm sitting there playing with it, and in a sense, younger and a little more naive, as it were. And, but both of us end up with I have to put it to use somewhere. And what's interesting is very rarely will I let the intuition just run standalone all over, because it'll trample. Because what happens, it's like a weed. If I don't understand bindweed by the two leaves that pop up that have pointy ends instead of the curved ends, it will root and it will be difficult to get rid of. But when it's new, it's easy to harness or to kill or to take it down or to apply it. So the verbs all end up with the same circumstance of it is now being utilized as a tool. But here, when he goes through the killing of the gods in themselves, it's that natural growth, birth, growth, death, compost, birth, growth, death, compost, that is just a cycle. And when he goes through the noon as a moment, midnight as a moment, one example I play with my clients is I say, okay, imagine your shadow at noon. And everyone gets it. You don't cast a shadow at noon. The sun is straight down. And I say the shadow is under your feet or under your rumpus if you're sitting down. And what happens is the shadow is hidden, but it is also supporting you. And so looking for the unseen and very childlike, kind of wanderlust examples sometimes brings it about where people understand, am I hiding it, or is it hiding, or is it simply hidden like a basement or an attic? And I think that concept of what is present that you cannot see comes up in this, killing of the gods piece, so that he is looking for a more complete, with the rain, the new wheat, the young germinating God, he's looking for his new God, as it were. And that new God is the continual rebirth of himself. And I think that's really what I find powerful about this passage. And he steps right past the betrayal piece with the Judas piece, and the assassination piece. And I kind of think that's important, because what's the old line of keep your friends close and your enemies closer? And that used to always perplex me, but one day I went, I think I get it. It's, your enemies already hate you. You don't have a relationship based on trust with your enemies. So they cannot, by their very nature, betray you. But when you keep them, so that means that the people who you trust close to you, that's where betrayal comes from. It's a trust relationship. And so what happens is when you keep the ring of enemies around you, when they part open like the Red Sea, incoming from someone you thought you trusted. So they're in a sense a barometer of betrayal. And by having them, if they start going quiet and you're all alone, you realize I better not look at them, look a little further out. So
if only I could tell you the story of what was happening to me this week in the school. And boy. Anyway, I can't, so I'm going to go on. But I have to add a couple of footnotes to this, and we may want to comment on those. In the draft, this sentence leads, we want to continue living with a new God, a hero beyond Christ. To Agnella Jaffe, he recounted that he thought of himself as an overcoming hero, but the dream indicated that the hero had to be killed. This exaggeration of the will was represented by the Germans at that time, such as by the Siegfried line, which was actually the name of a line in World War I. A voice within him said, quote, "If you do not understand the dream, you must shoot yourself." That's from Memories, Dreams, Reflections, page 98. or I'm sorry, Memory Street, page 2000 or 204. The original Siegfried Line was a defensive line established by the Germans in northern France in 1917. This was actually a subsection of the Hindenburg Line. And one other footnote. The theme of the dying and resurrecting God features prominently in James Frazer's The Golden Bough, a study in magic and religion, which Jung drew upon in Transformations and Symbols of the Libido. Now we're going to go on to chapter 8, which is the conception of God. And I want to read a couple of footnotes before I begin, just to sort of set the stage. So this is 2 days after the dream of the murder of Siegfried, December 20th, 1913. And here's what it says: a reference to Christ's parable of the mustard seed, which is Matthew 13, 31 and 32. Quote, "The kingdom of heaven is like to a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all seeds, but when it is grown, it is the greatest among herbs and becometh a tree." And there's a reference here, Luke 13, 18 through 20, and Mark 4, 30 through 32. And then another footnote. In Mark 16, verse 17, Christ stated that those who believe shall speak with new tongues. The issue of speaking in tongues is discussed in 1 Corinthians 14 and is central in the Pentecostal movement. And so as Jordan and I are speaking of Jungian psychology, it could be interpreted that we are speaking in new tongues, and so, notwithstanding the Pentecostals thinks that speaking in tongues means blurting out gibberish from their psyche. In fact, it probably means something more like what I've just said, which is that at that time, what Christ said and meant one thing to those early Iron Age men and women, but today it could mean something else. And so I doubt that any Pentecostal pastor will agree with me, but nonetheless, I acknowledge that I am speaking in tongues as compared to what that pastor would say. So I represent his shadow and he represents mine.
And I think that definitely to take that even further, a whole different view to me is Christ stated that those who believe shall speak with new tongues. That's a preambling of the Exodus, and that's a foreshadowing of exile, because that means you're going to speak in new tongues, meaning by the ones who believe will be exiled and put to other countries where you now learn another language. So there is the literal piece of it in a bigger scale picture that goes right along with what you just said, and it doesn't get embattled with it. It's just a different scale and a different perspective of, frankly, the wonderful ambiguity that goes through that passage in Corinthians, where it's saying a lot of things at one time, which is very much a psychological statement. And if I say, kill the old trees, well, what does that mean? Is that by default protecting the young trees? Because even in forestry, you don't always keep the strongest tree. Sometimes the little bitty one is the one you need to protect because that's for long term. Whereas sometimes that one needs to go out because it's a weed tree, so to speak. So I think the your example there of, between a Pentecostal and then what we're talking about here, it's a completely different language. And
right.
And when we say something that is wholly reasonable or wholly unreasonable, where reasons are unreasonable, we can pen gibberish on one or the other, except that even the gibberish is not going to be the, onomatopoeia, blah, 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 pre-symbolic baby noises that people are trying to, that's kind of just ecstatic dance with the mouth, I mean, they're just letting it go. Well, in college, they would call that verbal diarrhea,
Well, and so what you said about killing the old trees brought to mind something that I know from my youth, and I'm talking about really young. I was 5 or 6 when these events happened, but I lived in Kodiak. And there, on one side of the bay that is Kodiak, or where the Kodiak now Coast Guard station is, but where the Navy had a base at the time I was there, is Old Woman Mountain. And the Aleuts in ancient days would take women up to the top of that mountain, which was about 1,000 feet above the bay, and they would force them to jump off at the age of 30 and leaving only the young women. And the reason it came to me because of the kill the old trees is that, in my view, women are the tree of life, and men can't keep life going, only women can do that, and so they represent the tree of life. And so here the Aleuts were killing the old trees in favor of the young women, presumably for those paternalistic reasons that they didn't want to be talked back to by the women or something like that. But
that's the reason too, because we have Jung here at 38. He's about to turn 42. And that's astrologically, I call it the Ebenezer transit. That's when your transiting Neptune passes and squares your natal Neptune. And to put that in layman's terms, Neptune is boundarylessness. Think about Poseidon. Think about the structure of the ocean itself. Well, there's kind of a structure without stricture, but a square is a very strong right angle braced in woodworking relationship. So it's strong. Well, what happens is strength is given. So structure without stricture becomes a thing that inner identity actually actualizes. So if they get them at 30, it's a full almost generation, 12 years before they become wise, and they become themselves. And then what happens is then the old men can run the factory, which is just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. Well, I presume that in ancient days among the Aleuts, sometimes in a place like Kodiak, life was tough, and the tribe often lacked sufficient food for everyone. And so the women became the sacrifice so that the tribe could live on, while the men who were just coming into their adulthood where they could hunt were allowed to stay on because they were needed to keep the tree of life going. And I'm sure there were many other reasons, but telling a horrific tale like that is a way of everybody remembering that sometimes these things come up, and it's why we do speak. I readily acknowledge that I speak in tongues, and it no doubt is the shadow of the Pentecostals, but that's the way it is.
Definitely. And I think what's interesting is that brings up the whole conversation between life expectancy and life expectancy ability versus natural selection, aka natural culling. And now what with the Aleuts, they're consciously culling. But the thing about that is nature does that too. It's always shedding. It's always the chaff from the wheat, and then et cetera, et cetera. And, day dies to dusk, dusk dies to night, night gives way, dies to dawn, dawn dies. There's all this death, 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 so it's interesting to me that, my joke is life is fatal. My joke is that life is fatal. None of us are getting out alive.
Yeah, well, my comment also is that our food stores are actually temples to death, and all life lives on other life, and so that's a reality. We humans have the burden of knowing that and suffering its pain. Okay, so I'm now going to read the conception of God. I've given this preamble about the mustard seed. And so this is chapter 8 of the Red Book by C.G. Jung, page 164 in the Reader's Edition. On the second night thereafter, I spoke to my soul and said, quote, "This new world appears weak and artificial to me. Artificial is a bad word, but the mustard seed that grew into a tree, the word that was conceived in the womb of a virgin, became a god to whom earth was subject." As I spoke thus, the spirit of the depths suddenly erupted. He filled me with intoxication and mist and spoke these words with a powerful voice. And this is all in italics. Going on to the next page. I have received it in deepest need and lowliness. I covered it in shabby patchwork and bedded down in poor words, and mockery worshipped it. Your child, your wondrous child, the child of one who is to come, who should announce the Father, a fruit that is older than the tree on which it grew. In pain will you conceive, and joyful is your birth. Fear is your herald. Doubt stands to your right, disappointment to your left. We passed by in our ridiculousness and senselessness when we caught sight of you. Our eyes were blinded and our knowledge fell silent when we received your radiance. You new spark of eternal fire, into which night were you born? You will bring truthful prayers from your believers, and they must speak of your glory. Pardon?
You will ring, as in squeeze out W-R-I-N-G rather than bring.
Okay. You will ring. Okay. You will ring truthful prayers from your believers, and they must speak of your glory in tongues that are atrocious to them. You will come over them in the hour of their disgrace, and will become known to them in what they hate, fear, and abhor. Your voice, the rarest pleasing sound, will be heard amid the stammerings of wretches, rejects, and those condemned as worthless. Your realm will be touched by the hands of those who also worshipped before the most profound lowliness, and whose longing drove them through the mud tide of evil. You will give your gifts to those who pray to you in terror and doubt, and your light will shine upon those whose knees must bend before you unwillingly, and who are filled with resentment. Your life is with he who has overcome himself and who has disowned his self-overcoming. I also know that the salvation of mercy is given only to those who believe in the highest and faithlessly betray themselves for 30 pieces of silver. Those who will dirty their pure hands and cheat on their best knowledge against error and take their virtue from a murderer's grave are invited to your great banquet. The constellation of your birth is an ill and changing star. These, O child of what is to come, are the wonders that will bear testimony that you are a veritable God. Okay, I'll stop there, Jordan.
Yeah, that's what I love. I like that you said bring instead of ring, and then we corrected it because it really put my attention on the ring, W-R-I-N-G piece, meaning you will ring prayers from the disbelief. Well, what happens is that means that that's coming from there within. And then later in the passage, you talk about the gift of giving to bring the voice to them. So in a sense, he's starting with the pulling from them and then giving to them. And I think that's an important distinction, that it's not just foisting this stuff on them, it's pulling something natural out of them to then connect with the voice. The constellation of your birth is an ill and changing star. Well, I would kind of read in ill, meaning not stable. It's moving rather than, it's so, or it's just sitting there up in the birth is an ill and changing star. Does that mean it just looks like it's stationary, but then it's changing and it's moving? I mean, there's a lot of ways, almost infinite ways. I laugh at the word constellation and stars. I mean, there's infinite ways that can go. But then the ringing and then the bringing later of the gifts, I think are important in that, because it's touching on something that is within in the ringing part. And then the bringing is then the gift of the nourishment. And he's talking about nature. I mean, the fruit that is older than the tree that produced it, that's the tree birthing pure nature. That's the tree birthing its own origin, as it were, as a metaphor. And I think that's important in this, to my perspective, in this passage. I mean, your thoughts on these?
Well, my mind was sort of racing past my experiences of the past week. Of course, an adult is like a god to children who are in the age group 11 to 13. We're in most cases bigger than them, although not always. There are a few even sixth graders who are taller than me now. but I now because I've been teaching substituting at the same school for some time, I've now developed a cadre of traders who are trying to get me out of this school by all means necessary that they think they can pull off. And of course, they don't understand that I am stronger than they are, no matter who they are. Okay. And I had an experience with one boy who has a mother who's quite prominent in our school, who was part of a cadre of young men who were misbehaving through an entire class a month or so ago. And he didn't do the work that was assigned during that class, nor did any of this particular cadre of boys. And so this began with him writing on his paper a note to his teacher, saying, well, I didn't do the work because the substitute came and was talking to us. Okay, that was his message, and that he had written to his teacher. And I simply wrote on the same paper, well, if that's how he feels, we'll take it up with the assistant principal and he can tell his story, and then I'll tell my story.
Well, that's funny, because that reminds me, I remember back in college when one of my colleagues turns around to a professor and he goes, "Do you know who I am? Do you know who my dad is?"
Yeah.
And the professor leaned in. He goes, "Just like a bastard to not know his dad." And, it shut up that, who I am, trust this, trust fund that. I mean, it was gone. But it was, do you know who my dad is? What? You don't?
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to go into it any further than that, except that this young man is still trying to get me a month later. And in my perception, he's trying. And
that's an important part.
And we're gonna know now, because we're an hour into this very long session about the murder of the hero. We're gonna know if any of the students bring up the fact that I was talking about this situation in this class. If it gets reported up the line in the school district, we'll know that I'm being heard in the school district. That'll be cool.
Well, then the kids
anyway,
self-education.
It's time to learn about Jungian psychology, folks. We're no longer little children. Okay, do you want to?
They reported up the line, then they're beautifully guilty of self-education. And I think what's interesting is him trying to pick on you is that childish way of showing respect. He's trying to fall you as the hero down so he can step up. So in that sense, there's this kind of, he's looked to you as respect. He's testing you. And I think what's interesting about that is that's fine. But sometimes those tests end up with, do you know who my dad is? Oh, just like a bastard to not know. It's like,
okay. Yep. Anyway, moving on. Yes, please continue until you find a place to stop.
Okay. Part 2. When my prince had fallen, the spirit of the depths opened my vision and let me become aware of the birth of the new God. The divine child approached me out of the terrible ambiguity, the hateful beautiful, the evil good, the laughable serious, the sick healthy, the inhuman human, and the ungodly godly. I understood that the God whom we seek in the absolute was not to be found in absolute beauty, goodness, seriousness, elevation, humanity, or even in godliness. Once the God was there. Once the God was there.
No, once the God was there. In other words, not to be found in any of those things when the God is present, right?
Right.
Okay.
I understood that the new God would be in the relative. If the God is absolute beauty and goodness, how should he encompass the fullness of life, which is beautiful and hateful, good and evil, laughable and serious, human and inhuman? How can man live in the womb of the God if the Godhead himself attends only to one half of him? If we have risen near the heights of good and evil, then our badness and hatefulness lie in the most extreme torment. Man's torment is so great, and the air of the heights so weak, that he can hardly live anymore. The good and the beautiful freeze to the ice of the absolute idea, and the bad and hateful become mud puddles full of crazy life. Therefore, after his death, Christ had to journey to hell. Note here that before he said Christ became hell, here he's saying he's journeying to it. So we have something that's a little not amiss in this story. It's the love-hate. It's the both and. The place that was already there, the place that he's going to, that he created, became. But therefore, after his death, Christ had to journey to hell. Otherwise, the ascent to heaven would have become impossible for him. Christ first had to become his Antichrist, his underworldly brother. No one knows what happened during the 3 days Christ was in hell.
Okay, we
Stop.
we locked, so I
Oh,
don't know exactly what you were saying, but please repeat it.
okay.
Would be you had read would be impossible to him. Christ first had to become the well. You didn't get to that. You said
Oh,
Christ
okay.
had to journey to hell, and then you have to repeat what you said after that.
Okay. Therefore, after his death, Christ had to journey to hell. I added kind of a marginalia comment that just previously he said Christ became hell. Here
Yeah.
he's journeying to hell. And I don't find it to be contradictory. I think that's the love and the hate, the thing and the nothing, that he's playing the both and now this is the second part of the story where of the murder of the hero, where hell already exists. So it's a journey to it rather than Christ becoming it. And I think that's an important clarification, just
Right.
so it doesn't look like, well, wait a second, you said this a second ago. They're not gossip that conflict with each other. They're two sides of the same coin that work together.
Right. And did you read the rest of the paragraph?
Yeah, and then I went back and reread that line in the
Go
paragraph.
ahead.
So therefore, after his death, Christ had to journey to hell. Otherwise, the ascent to heaven would have become impossible for him. Christ first had to become his antichrist, his underworldly brother.
Right.
No one knows. Yeah,
So the point of the duality is that the existence of Christ in the flesh meant that the Antichrist was constellated.
right.
That was the shadow.
Right.
And so I would say my point here at this point is that the Bible is the greatest story ever told because it was already preconceiving Jungian psychology before there was even psychology. In other words, out of the pens of early Iron Age men who were learning from their fathers, their patriarchal line since Abraham, so 1500 years. For those 1500 years, and for all the years since then, the Bible and its teachings have been so powerful because they do, in metaphor, express basically the same ideas that are in Jungian psychology. Mm-hmm. And oh, by the way, also basically the same ideas as are in Tibetan Buddhism, which is what Jung felt was the closest religion to his perspective being based on the Western idea of the Christian ethic and the Bible and so on, because his father was a pastor. Mm-hmm. And so here we are making no criticism of the Bible. In fact, I now say that when people say the Bible is true, I say every word of the Bible is absolutely true. And some of it contains actual physical history, but the rest of it contains what humanity needed from a psychological point of view, which is Jungian psychology. So now we're mature enough in the last 100 years since he came along and started making these observations to look back at the Bible and say, wow, this is an amazing document. And it has amazing applications to our lives because it is expressing what human beings actually know about psychology. And by the way, that's also true of the Quran. It's also true of the 84,000 teachings of the Buddha, and so on. Okay, all of those things are further teachings, including for the Jewish religion, because obviously the Pentateuch is how the Jewish faith follows this. So anyway, it's all there.
it's all there. And also, then it's not heresy to say also it's a preface to Grimm's fairy tales.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's not in any way a disparaging comment. It's actually a very, very high accolade, because
Right.
these are things that you can read biblically with a good translation. You can read biblically and it will stir your insides.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the point. I mean, so you don't want to get that stillborn psyche that you're running around wondering why you can't do anything. Well, because it's all settled down. It's like, don't be too settled down. I mean, it's
Right. So, I mean, in a sense, we could say that January 6th was and is in all of us, and it erupted from a certain cadre of people. But that doesn't mean it's okay because that's what they believe. That's not okay because civilization says that it's not okay. And, you know, the ones who are learning that are the ones who are being prosecuted and convicted of crimes that are causing them to spend a little time out in prison.
well, yeah, and that's a larger scale version of your little Judas attempt boy.
Right.
Because except his is legitimate to grow, theirs is not legitimate because they're supposed to be adults. I mean,
Right. They're supposed to be adults and having.
And
Right.
I laugh that validation is great when you're young.
Right.
Accolades are nice occasionally through life, but I think once you're an adult, validation is just for parking. It's like
Well, right, and I had an exchange with Tim that's quite powerful, and I don't think we're going to get through this chapter on the conception of God, so maybe I should go back and share at least a part of my interaction with Tim and with my fellows in preparation for the confluence. We're going to be let's see. I have to go back, and this is relevant to all of us right now because there are a number of movies that are not quite congruent. Okay, in other words, people have to ask. And welcome, Kathy. Nice to see you. Great to see you. Okay, so we've been talking about the topic of the feminine rising for our confluence, and at the same time, and about 2 weeks ago, my wife and I saw the Banshees of Inisherin, and I was disturbed by the movie, and then I read a wonderful review of it, and so I'm not going to read that review, I don't think, because I guess I'm not going to read that review, but I do want to read an exchange that Tim and I had that is relevant to that review. And so, and keeping in mind now that this is 7 very thoughtful artists and other leaders who put together the confluence that we had last June, and we're putting together the confluence that we're having next October 13th to the 16th at Mount Madonna Conference Center in California. And so I'll be going out there in April as part of the training or the preparation for that. And so since last June, we've been having an ongoing conversation about the feminine rising, which we had presumed or do presume that is the topic. But this is sharing a little bit of my angst about the idea of the feminine rising. And so I'm speaking privately in this case to my 6 friends and who are organizing this with me. So I said, dear friends, something previously inexpressible has been bothering me concerning what we are about in our confluence. As much as Thomas Arst's article summarized our cultural condition in a postmodern society, it is clear that the attached review of 3 of this year's Oscar nominated films nailed the further problem, which I hope we can explore a bit further in Confluence. For this, we will need more men to attend than our present company. Interestingly, at the risk of seeming like a hammer wielder who sees every problem as a nail, I do think our focus on our collage activity will start to yield some answers from the collective, provided all of we men also commit to putting our shoulders to the wheel of being fully engaged in the collage creating process. What has been eating at me about the feminine rising theme is that it seems to me to be falling into the oppositional trap, which is so well documented by Jungian psychology. Yes, women's rights and other issues of the feminine are quite important to the entire complexity of our cultures, but we have had women's rights activists handling those issues since the 1960s. So the question arises, what can we add to the overall picture? It seems to me that we can add a strategy to identify at least a direction for what comes next in our national and global human cultures, given the complexity of the Arst article and the attached article identify. Okay, now the Arst article is the first article of the series called Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, which I read Dr. Arst's article in its entirety into this YouTube channel, and you can find it under the Jung's Red Book for Our Time. What is it called? The collection of some of my videos. So anyway, I want to go on with this. But his article is explaining what postmodern means, which was a word I was unsure of and didn't understand what the heck he was talking or what people were talking about when they used postmodern. Until now, I understand it thanks to Dr. Arst. So you might want to go back and listen to that reading. But in any case,
I have to comment too on postmodern because we're in a broken record history titling era.
right.
I mean, modernism is the most vague title for anything. Right. When Michelangelo carved David, it was modern at the time. Now we go and capitalize modern allegorically, and we title it a whole movement. Then we have modern, and then we have postmodern. And frankly, in college, I remember this woman going, "Oh, it's just postmenstrual. Come on, let's move on." And it was the kind of thing where she was putting forth that experience of this happens all the time, but let's move on. So stop hyphenating suffix and prefix on modern. And where are we is the question. And I think then what's interesting is with the laws, then what happens is the exact reverse happens. The laws apply to the women's bodies. And my thought is that let's stop treating the nation like children. And instead of all the little girls who have these laws on their bodies, there should be as many laws about women as there are on the books as there are about men. And that number is exactly 0. Right. And so if we got there, that's not equality. That's let's move on. Let's then instead of rights, it's that should just be simple and understood. And instead of we have to fight for, one gender to be represented, it's like, no. This is not slavery. This is not suffrage. This is, people, not a gender. And so I think the laws don't reflect people, they reflect gender.
Right. Okay. So there's a term in the next paragraph of what I wrote, which I should explain, which fundamentally explains the difference from in our idea from modern to postmodern. And the term is ontological security. And what that means is that we feel secure when we live in a container. Okay, that container can be a marriage. Okay, and Dr. Jung pointed out that in a marriage, one party is always the container and one is always the contained. And that may switch back and forth, as it certainly does in Deb's and my relationship. But it also applies to the church. We feel if we are devout Christians or Jews or Muslims, we feel contained in our religion. But if we start to doubt, then we are not contained. So ontological security relates to the idea that we feel contained in whatever situation. And our point is that postmodern is when we've lost our containers in too many ways. And he talks about the many ways in which in post-World War II, globally, we all lost a lot of ontological security. We lost the containers in which we lived our lives. And so here's what I said in my paragraph. I think of ontological security I experienced in the U.S. Marines as a young man. Whenever I mention the Marines, the first image that comes to most people's minds is the belligerent platoon sergeant or drill instructor shouting into the face of the recruit from 1 inch away. And yes, that is quite masculine. But what is not shown is the softness and feminine approach that the same sergeant uses 1 hour later in teaching those same recruits how to make their beds, clean their rifles, and attend to their physical and mental hygiene and safety on the highway. Between 2006 and 2021, only about 25% of all military deaths occurred in overseas combat zones, and these are statistics comparable to my active experience during the Vietnam era. 31.8% of deaths come from traffic accidents and 24.8% come from self-inflicted wounds, mostly post-deployment, I presume. Of 5,913 auto accident deaths, 5,419 occurred in non-combat areas. These statistics are unchanged from the Vietnam era and probably before that. My point here is that in culture, in a culture that does provide ontological security, both masculine and feminine values are needed. And even in the Marine Corps, the feminine characteristics are overweighted as one rises in rank. There are very few cigar chomping hard chargers over the rank of major. We must put the war between men and women behind us. And just as an aside on that, when I was in training in OCS in 1967 and in the basic school in 68, the last lesson of any week, every week on Friday, the last lesson given before Liberty was a lesson about traffic accidents, showing very gory images of traffic deaths to remind everybody to drive safely when they went out on Liberty. And of course, kids in that age group often drink too much and get themselves in trouble. And as you see, many die. So going on,
That's a ontological security there is really important, just from
Yeah.
how to work under deadline and also not go insane, and how to produce things and also stay healthy. Because what happens is when you're focused, you're that blowtorch, you're the tuned flame, you are a tool, you are getting things done. The thing is, when you relax, that flame goes loose. It has no danger to anyone, really.
Right.
And the thing is, it loses its identity. And ontology, deals with the nature of being, and so even in, Milan Kundera's title of his book, the unbearable lightness of being, what happens is when you let go, when you relax, and say that word differently, when you relax, I mean, you pull back. And what's interesting, you also let go. The container's not there to hold you. You do not see the nature of your being in a form. You, in a sense, let it go AWOL. It just kind of, opens up. And the problem with that is a lot of people are not comfortable when there's no pressure to hold them together, or there's no form to hold them together. And, my object example is right before a tornado, the pressure drops. And for the first time in your life, you don't understand that you're really walking around in an ocean of air that has pressure. And when that pressure drops, the first time you experience it, it's pretty wiggy, because the only thing holding you together is your own body not coming apart. You don't understand that you've been fully supported so much. You assume it, but people can go pretty nuts right at the pressure drop. Just scan the people you're with. Some people will be, yeah, okay, we're gonna have a tornado. They're looking for where to go. Other people's eyes, just the pupils go huge. They don't understand. They think they're about to die. What happens
Okay.
is the container's been removed. And so I
Right.
think the ontological security of when the container's removed, what happens? And that's that
Okay.
Friday Liberty statement.
Right. So I'm already on a tangent, Jordan. So let me get through the rest of my email to the group and then Tim's response to it. And let's not go further tangential for the moment, because I'm already on a tangent, and this is
Yeah, I won't fill your
Jung's.
gas tank.
Okay. All right. So, and I'm sharing something that's very personal and very private in general, but I want to share some of the thinking that is going into our confluence. Okay, and so I'm going to continue here. I'm all for the feminine rising in the sense of bubbles previously suppressed rising to their appropriate level, which can and does now lead to political leadership, among other things. But I am against the notion that this necessarily means even the appearance of the suppression of masculine bubbles to achieve it. Both are needed. What is the myth we are living now? It seems to me that we made a crucial cultural mistake when we let statistics-based MBAs tell us that we could make more money by sending our manufacturing overseas. As Colonel Nicholson, Alec Guinness, knew in The Bridge Over the River Kwai, if you don't have something for men to do, building a bridge in this case, then you are leading a rabble, witness January 6th. Nicholson's problem was that he lost sight of the fact that while building a bridge was a useful tool to hold his battalion together, he was still at war, and it was his duty to destroy it in the end. This is why the last word in the movie is madness. Please forgive this long musing of a Saturday morning. If you don't understand Banshees of Inisherin, this review might help you in going into this year's Oscars, and I had attached the review. But then Tim came back and said the following. I want to share with you. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm not going to share that, but I am going to share Tim's reply. Thanks, Skip, and you all for this meditation on masculinity. This is a very prescient subject and a complex one. I think men have done a wonderful job over the eons of fulfilling their masculine capacity, mostly creating a workable civilization structure and fighting to protect the home. But the world is a lot safer now for individuals, and much has already been carved out of raw nature. Now men are faced with a world where traditional masculinity doesn't really help in one's daily affairs. In the words of the reviewer, quote, as masculinity tears itself apart under the weight of culture's contradictions, unquote. We men can see that our traditional purpose has expired, but with the toxicity of traditional masculinity exposed, we have no idea what to do next. Thus, the terrible pandemic of men's despair. Yes, we have to evolve. As for myself, I don't want to diminish hate, much as that seems helpful. I want to transform it. Sympathy by itself is very flaccid. In order for compassion to have any depth, it has to be built on a foundation of solid hate for not just anything, but hate for injustice. To me, what makes masculinity toxic is not the presence of something that needs to be eradicated, violence, power, discrimination, etc., but an absence of compassion. Traditional masculinity would be gloriously healthy if only it were infused top to bottom with deep compassion. This is where religion provides a unique impetus. Where else are genuine uplifting communal values to come from? Religion needs the same, not an eradication of something, but an infusion of compassion. In my own life, I have had a terrible struggle about 30 years ago with an inner figure that I called the drill sergeant. He was constantly after the artist for not working hard enough, being good or wise enough. The two of them wanted to kill each other. After some serious counseling, I finally got them to acknowledge each other, then talk to each other. Eventually, the artist offered the drill sergeant the drill sergeant a job. Quote, stand outside my studio and protect me from the world, unquote. The drill sergeant was quite good at that and relished the job. The two have since been in pretty good harmony, the artist taking on the feminine duties and the drill sergeant, the masculine ones. This is a metaphor that I find interesting. Could there be a cultural lesson here? I don't know what's to come, but we are carving our way into the future. This confluence is a part of that important work. Thank you all for the rich dialogue and the ongoing struggle. In order to progress, we have to stumble along with good intent, and it helps to have good friends along the way. Thanks for the great circle. Blessings, Tim. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. There was more to this exchange, but it's private, and I'm not going to share it. And even that was private. But I felt the exchange on masculinity was an important one, especially as we go into the Oscars this year, because of the three movies that were in the original review, that all, may not, you may not like to begin with. And I think specifically the Banshees of Inisherin. I've not seen the other two movies, but in the Banshees, you may not understand what this movie is about until you understand what's happened to masculinity in our society. And so therefore, I do think it's, I think that it's a very good movie, number one. It obviously is beautifully photographed, etc., and acted. And when I first got to the end of it, I said, "Why are we seeing this?" But then when I read this review about, the loss of traditional masculinity, it struck me that it's very prescient, and it's something that we all need to think about. And so before I felt that this tangent was useful as an aside from what Jung is talking about here. But now you can comment. And Kathy, I would wait a minute before you do it, Jordan. Let's give Kathy a chance because she's kindly joined us. And if you have a comment, Kathy, I'd love to hear it.
Well, thanks for the welcome.
You're welcome.
Good to have you here.
It's my first Zoom live with anybody like this that, hasn't been in my Zoom room with guests of my Pilates, crew. So this is fun.
Nice.
I appreciate you very much for sharing your interaction and the letters in as much as you could. One of the things that I've always felt and, just observed and, I have opinions about everything, great and small. That's just how I'm built.
All of us do.
Right. But I'm willing to admit it.
Nice.
At least in present company, we do admit it.
Yeah.
Good. And sometimes that could get tender between us, just saying, in advance, just in case.
Well, and I appreciate you say that because I think Skip and I operate not so much the unthreatened as a buster or thing like that. It's the unthreatened being dignity and difference. Tell me about your culture. Don't knock off the sharp, hard edges. Teach me how to walk around without getting cut, which to me means
I'm going to hold you to it. Yeah. I'll be holding you to it for sure. So, and I appreciate it very much. In terms of like the whole, is it feminine uprising?
The rising feminine, yeah.
The rising feminine.
Or the feminine rising, depending on which title we finally select.
Well, I hope it's none of those, ultimately, because I don't know. There's never going to be equality in the focus on duality, and there's never going to be equality on the focus of opposition. It just stretches things apart. And, I'm all for humanity's liberation of any unnecessary oppression, suppression, humanity. And I'm all for gender. Please don't call me they, them, please. I don't want us all to become its and theys and thems. And please don't come for me. This is all just my opinion. And I'm like talking to everybody like today live. And then those of us who view this in the future. It's just me talking.
Sure.
It's just, it's always made me very sad. The burning of the bras in order to have to gain power, I'll hold my own door, without even saying a thank you very much. And I'm not necessarily ascribing masculine and feminine attributes or risings or oppressions to certain contributions or behaviors. I will hold a door for a gentleman if I get there first and it's appropriate. You know it. And he's going to thank me and I'm going to say, you're very welcome. Humanity, people. Humanity.
Absolutely. I often have women holding doors for me because...
So the war against gender.
Because I am handicapped and I walk with a cane, and very often women hold doors for me. So go ahead.
No, I love that. And even without that, there's a seriously good reason to do it. It's just like, I got here first and you're a person and this isn't a gender ascribed activity any more than doing the dishes, or if a woman wants to fix a car, fine. I mean, it's not about those lines, those superficial lines. It's about how those lines have brought us to a place of viewing each other on a very deep, contentious level. I'm either going to resent you or I'm going to fear you. What is it? Take your pick. I mean, what happened to, I'm sorry, flow of the age of Aquarius? I mean, maybe we're going back there. It might take us hundreds of years, but just the less conditional loving of each other. Just because we're here, because you exist.
Yeah, this is the flow of the age of Aquarius.
Yeah, exactly. So,
We are the flow of the age of
and
Aquarius.
I think that's one of the discontentions right now that we're all like having a time with and a good opportunity to face is, do you want to go there, or, you know, are you going to get super stuck with, you know, the Hierophant way of, you know, traditional stuckness, superficial stuckness, or, you know, however you want to view that. So anyway, yeah, I would like to see us get back to that. I mean, there's a lot of details within all of that that we could take hours talking about and
Surely.
unpacking together and, you know, talk about our personal stories or whatever. But as a woman who has, you know, very masculine attributes and very feminine attributes, I feel like the rising feminine or the feminine rising or whatever discounts a lot of things. What about the masculine in me? What's she supposed to do during that confluence? What about the masculine in you? Are you supposed to only show up with your anima? I mean, and then what? You know, and then, you know, women get to, nobody rises up due to someone else's lowering of themselves.
Right. And that's exactly what my exchange with Tim and the others was about, or is about.
Yeah, so I would
exchange. It's an ongoing discussion that we haven't finalized by any means, and we probably won't finalize until the 13th of October. But at the moment, it's you know, as I said at the beginning of my initial email there, that what had been bothering me, which was inexpressible until now, because I had read these three reviews of the three movies, was that by talking about the feminine rising, or with the rising feminine, we were falling into the duality trap. And we need to be beyond that, because the other part of the seven of us is that we're all Jungians. We're not Jungian analysts, but we're all Jungian in our perspective on life. And so
I think that duality trap was brilliantly expressed by Kathy with one word when you said humanity. It's like, let's get past Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers and let's talk about the dance instead. You know, it's the humanity, it's the both and rather than the either or. And honestly, the title, The Feminine Rising or The Rising Feminine, it doesn't matter to me which way that goes. That is a title about a feminine topic emerging, birthing, that is expressed in male combative warring language. This, you know, it's like the movie, The Feminine Rising. I might as well say The 300 or The Bridge Over the River Kwai. There's this,
right.
you know,
Fair
here comes the war. The enemy's coming over the horizon. Oh no, you know, lock and load. Well, what happens is that's little boy threatened. And we're still not in humanity. We're in this little baby masculine. But what happens is we let it grow up. You become unthreatened like a parent with a child. And what happens then, it's not the reason being just because you're unthreatened, meaning you're strong enough to be gentle and fierce enough to be compassionate because you're not afraid. And, you know, afraid is, you know, fear hijacked by anxiety. Fear is actually just what's on the radar, you know, feeling energized and ready. Fear being, here, they're external forces, but I'm not going to go to war with all of them. But that's telling me here comes an interaction. Well, toddler walks in the room, you know, the only new thing I'm going to learn is that the fastest land mammal is a toddler asks what's in your mouth, you know, like to zoom right away. You see the fire behind them. Well, that's a really small, childish kind of example, but of a parent engaged in parenting. That's not war. This is cultivating humanity from the small tree to the big tree. And so when Kathy, when you said humanity, I think that was wonderfully loaded, not like a clip in a gun. It was loaded in that it can be unpacked And the beautiful ambiguity of the word humanity means we're all living together, because the other word for humanity is community, which is just humanity in a group, a specific group. So I think getting past the duality, what's masculine, what's feminine, I, they, we, them, it, when you said it. Well, what's that doing? That's watering down the identity or the ontology, as you said, Skip. Ontological security is I see the nature of my being in a form. But when I see humanity, I see all the different versions so far of what I can see as humanity and being in a form. But back to, I have to say, Kathy, you nailed it. One word, humanity.
Yeah.
And, maybe even say humanity. Well, then that sounds absurd, and no, don't. It's just a word, and we don't have to, play the man-woman game with it. It's all of us together as a concept.
Yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
We show each other when we care about each other. All these buzzwords, we got to ditch them, you guys. In my opinion, like any of it. Anything that is like singular focus is exclusive of everything else, and there's another separation and disconnection. And when are we going to stop falling for it?
Yep, that's what.
When are we going to stop giving it airtime? When are we going to start saying, I want to celebrate you, this is an important moment for you, or hey, I'm going to call you to the mat because we are in deep and egregious disagreement here, and I want to have a private conversation with you, whatever it is, conflict, celebration, neutrality, whatever it is.
Yeah, we're in deep doo-doo as civilization, both in the United States and globally.
Well,
you can't do that.
Ditch the buzzwords, because the adjectives are in the way. We don't know the noun, we don't know the verb. We have to re-describe things to not harm. It's like, no, I'm going, like you said, I'm going to call you to the mat. Well, I'm calling you to the mat. I'm not drawing my sword. It's a kind of thing where people get threatened. And the reality is, drop the buzzwords. Because like Colleen Keebert says, God help the artist with a gimmick. Let's drop drop the buzzwords, get to the substance, and let that surface be generated by the substance. So like you said, I'm going to celebrate you. I'm going to call you to the mat. Either way, that's paying attention, and that's care and value expressed. And we know that, we get it. But the buzzwords are just a bunch of gimmicky, like you said, deep doo-doo.
They are, but we all fall into it because we've been trained deeply for quite some time now. We've been honed to separate and disconnect from each other through one means or another. And as soon as we are onto one means, they use another, whoever they are. The gatekeepers of all the cashola, I guess. I mean, people tell me it boils down to money.
Time out, Kathy.
I don't know.
We had a brain freeze here again, so we missed everything you said after. It was, but we all fall into it, and then nothing. So could you say the last part of what you just said again? Thank you.
I was, that part just meant, we all have been duped by what I believe has been the construct of keeping us disconnected and keeping humanity separated from humanity, because when humanity is in a position to honor humanity for humanity's sake, whether it be on the close level of a village or the global, whatever it is, the cry is very loud and passionate, and there are stakes there.
And that is exactly what our politicians do to us on all sides. They try
it is sadly, it is sadly all political. And because they've also created a belief system that there's something we can do about it by voting.
Right.
Then, it just keeps going and going and going. And I'm not suggesting people don't vote. I'm just saying that, they throw us breadcrumbs.
Yeah, they throw us a bone every so often, but they don't let it be resolved. And
But my
that-
bottom line is, I believe that like places like this with, being able to have discourse or harmony or whatever, where we're all safe and
yeah, and
able to
there's
say
a
is
Well, the
there's an
media,
interesting there's an interesting story that the Dalai Lama tells when he's has a debate going on between Christ and the Buddha, and he asks them, what is it that keeps you apart? Okay, what is it that keeps Christ and the Buddha apart? And they both say in unison, our fans, quote unquote.
our fans. Well,
Right.
that's funny. That goes right into the thing of, okay, we vote, we get new politicians. Well, then we just have different media barraging and exhausting us, which makes us easier to push around. The thing is, though, if you look at what's the natural thing that happens after a tornado, there's no power, there's no water, and what happens? The people come together because they're not held apart by being exhausted by, I'm looking in my black mirror. Well, it's like I have to look you in the eye and, oh, well, we need to get that pipe out of your living room, And did you notice there was a fish swimming through the bedroom because, it's flooded? I mean, the thing is, the people come together, as Kathy said,
Yeah,
I'm going to celebrate you. When there's no power, the community comes together. Go ahead.
As the Methodist minister in Tennessee or Eastern Kentucky said a year or so ago, when his church and his whole community was destroyed by a tornado, he's asked by the reporter, the stock question is, why does God allow such things to happen? And he says, well, that's not God's job. God or religion or belief in religion is about how we treat one another after a tornado.
Mm-hmm.
He's not in the business of creating tornadoes. Kathy, go ahead.
what I really want to say is, when are we going to stop waiting for tornadoes to be nice to each other overall? Like, why? Because, that wears off. The acute tenderness toward each other after a disaster is like the acute tenderness of losing a loved one. We can't live in that grief space.
Right.
Yeah,
We can't live in that raw wound place. Why do we want to? I mean, that just gets us addicted to chaotic living and responding to drama.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah,
Why?
you're absolutely right on the money, because what happens is that vulnerability place is a place you have just molted. You just lost your crab shell. Everyone's vulnerable, so everyone's going to come together because they don't want to get harmed. But then if you stay there and you don't resume your skin, you don't reconstitute your identity, well, why don't you still not be, some rude, interfering person the next day when everyone's back to, normal? Why can't you turn around and you don't need the crisis? And I call that crisis mongering. People create a crisis so they can solve it. The problem is you created it, so it's not really a crisis. You just are dramaing.
Well,
we get good at what we practice.
Right.
We get good at what we practice. So, we've been in the practice of being disconnected, and we can get good at connecting again. It just takes practice.
Surely. And what Jung says in the black books, which he doesn't say in the red book, is the solution to all these dualities is in the human being. That's how it gets resolved, in the human being and in human society. And unfortunately, he leaves that out when he writes the red book. So this is why, and it just so happens that I'm reading volume 6 of the black books now. I'm almost finished reading all 7 volumes, but I have about 50 pages to go. But he says that in volume 6 in a footnote, and Shamdasani points out, and this was left out in the red book. So this is why I do think it's probably something that we need to take up after we complete the Red Book, because the Red Book is what everybody knows, and everybody's seen the set of the Black Books, and they put it on their shelf if they have $300. But I don't think most people, with the exception of Sona Shamdasani and I, have even read all the Black Books as yet. Maybe there are a few who have done, but what I see immediately is there's incredible information in what was included in the Red Book and what was left out. And so I think that is going to be the follow-on program after we get through the Red Book. We have quite a way to go in the Red Book yet, but maybe at the end of this year we'll move on to the Black Books, and then we'll start talking about these distinctions that Jung made. Either, he either commented on them at a different place in his career, or, which is what Shamdasani knows, he's a professor of Jung history, and so he's dedicated his life to this, and to his great credit that he knows all this, but he has put it in the footnotes. So in the Black Books, in the volumes, more than half of the volume is taken up by a photocopy of the Black Books in German, but then the translation is there. And then also what is there is Shamdasani's footnotes, which says, oh, well, this word was left out of the Red Book, or this word was it changed in the Red Book to be this word. And when you see the changes that Jung was making when he was actually inscribing the Red Book originally, in the late teens and the 1920s, you see what his mindset was, even in the change of a single word. It's really a fascinating thing, and the fact that I for a long time wondered why Dr. Shamdasani was spending 10 years getting the Black Books out, but it's very clear to me that he recognized that there is such a difference between the Black Books and the Red Books, and that difference is significant, and it needs to be brought out. That's why I think that this discussion is going to go on, but we're going to then go back to the Black Books and do the comparison, because
and I think that
so
significant. That brings up the true importance of the currency of value of the process rather than the show pony product.
Yeah.
And the thing about that is, I don't want to really see all the blood, sweat, and tears of my poet. I want the poet, but the Black Books are the blood, sweat, and tears. And when something like that, you get something from it. And I think I found something this last week, Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And this, to me, her quote here is kind of how to not be judgmental, at the same time, how to connect and how to understand other people in a way that you don't need to understand, you need to connect, and with discretion, obviously. But her quote is, "The miracle of the psyche's ways is that even if you are half-hearted, irreverent, didn't mean to, didn't really hope to, don't want to, feel unworthy to, aren't ready for it, you will accidentally stumble upon treasure anyway. Then it is your soul's work to not overlook what has been brought up, to recognize treasure as treasure, no matter how unusual its form." And I would add that the people, we interact with around us are treasures. And when you look at people that way, then they're them. And instead of us, them, it becomes, again, back to humanity.
Righto. And now we need to change back to the YouTube audience just for a minute. Michelle Randolph has made an interesting comment. She said, I believe the proper education and mentorship of children and allowing children to have rights would change so much in the world. Just an idea I have sometimes. Well, I think that's all well and good, except that I see that's what's happening in my school district. We have allowed children to have so many rights that we're raising children who are flaccid, who are not citizens of our society. And by this, I mean that, I'll give an example that I gave long ago in the earlier versions of this YouTube channel, which was that, the soccer moms insist on every child gets a trophy. Well, life isn't like that. Every person doesn't get a trophy. And children need to learn that non-performance doesn't earn you a trophy. And children need to learn to deal with that disappointment. And when we give every child a trophy, then they don't learn to deal with disappointment that they're certainly going to face in their adult life. Everybody does. And so I'm not disagreeing with Michelle, and I'm going to read her comment again, but I just wanted to provide my reaction to it, and then I'll add what Jonty said here. Here's what Michelle said again. I believe the proper education and mentorship of children and allowing children to have rights would change so much in the world. Just an idea I have sometimes. And Jonty says, sorry, just like getting involved. Once the understanding has been reached, Anima and Animus shouldn't become Bonnie and Clyde. Well, yeah, but Bonnie and Clyde were simply the shadow of society at that time, weren't they?
Yeah.
I don't know. Kathy, I'm going to give you the final word on this. And so we will continue our discussion next week. And we are in the conception of God discussion. And we are on page 167 in the very first paragraph, which we haven't even gotten through. But page 167, the very first paragraph, that's where we will begin next week. And great that you have your edition, Kathy. But Kathy, you get the final word here.
Well, I'm not sure. I don't know Michelle. I'm not in her mind, but the way I read that is, key is the proper education and proper mentorship, which in my heart landed as, let's show kids some respect. And then based on your response, I would say, respecting each other does not mean turning the other cheek and enabling each other to act entitled. Respecting each other includes, hey, kiddo, it's okay. You lost the game. Everybody still loves you. And it doesn't even matter that you made the final foible. It's just a game. And we respect each other when we agree to the rules of the game. And the rules of the game implied that you and your team lost. Oh, well.
Yeah.
We sometimes we lose, sometimes we win, but we respect you and love you. And what else do you need to say? Are you sad about losing? Let's show kids some respect.
Yep. Yes. I think that's beautiful. That's a beautiful comment. Thank you, Kathy.
And because we've seen, different waves of generations either being too heavy-handed or too soft, and the outcomes of all of that. That in my heart is the superficial conversation.
Surely it is. Surely
of humanity applies to children.
Right.
But you should, it's perfect. Show kids respect, and then they respect other people as adults. Right. And they keep showing respect. That's beautifully said.
Right. And so Jonty's final comment is, my point is, some people insist on the tension. Well, surely they do, but it has to, as I was pointing out in what I said about Jung, the tension has to be resolved in the human and in our society. It isn't going to be resolved in books. It's not going to be resolved in teachings. It's not going to be resolved in church. It's going to be resolved within each of us. And then through each of us resolving the tension within ourselves, then we can resolve our own societies and perhaps the global society at some point.
And just like Kathy said, show kids some respect. Well, show the word tension some respect, because tension is simply a force that binds things together. It doesn't have to be we are at odds or we are opposed. Tension is simply a force that's pulling. Right. It's compelling.
And
this is tension. I mean, it actually pulls. So what happens is there's an attraction, there's a force. So when we say, Buckminster Fuller said intention is integrity. What that meant is that the identity is held together by all these forces. And instead of tension being, oh God, we have strife and conflict, it doesn't have to be that way.
I love that, because what really keeps planets in the sky is tension combined with integrity, which is actually tensegrity. And it's not pulling. It's almost like push hands in Tai Chi. It's we're going together, it's or apart or whatever it is, but it's organic.
It's just like push hands.
And it does hold things up.
Yeah, it's always connected, never loses contact, and never engages and never disconnects. So, right. That's humanity.
I want to go back to what Tim said, and I'm going to stop us at that point. But what Tim said was sympathy is too flaccid. Okay. Compassion is what we need. Yeah. Not to resolve our differences by sympathy with the other person, or even empathy, but putting ourselves in the other shoes, walking a mile in someone else's shoes and understanding how they feel. And that, it seems to me, is the beginning of compassion, when we can walk in someone else's shoes for a mile.
And then take them back, so you're not a thief.
Yeah, precisely. That's compassionate too, because they need their shoes as well.
Well, Nietzsche, if you gaze long enough into the abyss, the abyss gazes back. But right. The way I add to it is, well, if you gaze too long into the abyss leans forward and says, it's really, really rude to stare.
Okay, we have to end for the day. But thank you, everyone, for being here.
Kathy, thanks for coming to show up here.
Yes, and Kathy, thank you so much for joining us. You certainly added to our discussion. And
thanks for having me.
So this chapter that we have begun, which is entitled The Conception of God, is quite long. It's, more than 10 pages long. And so it may take us several weeks to complete it. But we are currently at the very top of page 167 in the reader's edition of the Red Book. So, and on the chapter entitled The Conception of God. So we will continue on that again next week, and I hope you all can join us then. So anyway, thanks so much for coming, Kathy. I'm really glad to have you here. You've been on our YouTube channel for so long that I'm delighted to have you appear finally and start to chat with us directly. So
nice.
Peace. Take care.